The wind outside the hospital window sounded like something dying. Minneapolis was buried under 14 inches of snow, the kind of blizzard that erased the horizon and turned the world into a seamless wall of white. But inside the waiting room, it was sterile, silent. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, electric frequency that felt like it was drilling into my teeth. I looked at the clock. 11:51 p.m. Zachary had been dead for exactly 12 minutes. I didn't cry. I think part of me froze along with the city. I just sat there, my hands numb, holding my phone like it was a foreign object. I needed to call someone. I needed to tell his family. My family... My finger hovered over my mother's contact name. Angela. It felt heavy, impossible. But instinct is a cruel thing. It makes you reach for people who have never once reached back for you. I dialed. The phone rang once, twice. Then it connected, but not to a voice. It connected to a wall of noise. Bass-heavy music. High-pitched laughter. The clinking of expensive glass. Hello? My mother's voice was a shout, distorted by the party around her. Jasmine, why are you calling right now? Mom, I said. My voice sounded small, thin, like it belonged to a child I didn't recognize. It's Zachary. He's gone. What? She shouted over a sudden cheer from the crowd. I can't hear you. Look, Alexis is about to cut the cake. It's her 30th. Remember? The gala? Mom, please listen. Zachary died. He's dead. There was a pause. For a second, I thought she heard me. I thought the world would stop. Jasmine! Honestly! She snapped, her tone shifting from distracted to annoyed. Don't ruin the vibe right now! We are cutting the cake! Call me tomorrow! The line went dead. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the silence rush back in. The dial tone was a flat, singular note. It was the sound of my life breaking into two distinct parts. Before I knew who they really were, and after. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I lowered the phone from my ear. The silence in the waiting room was heavier than the snow piling up against the glass. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, at the call-ended notification. My thumb hovered over the redial button. It was a reflex, an ancient muscle memory instinct. Why had I even called her? Why, in the most devastating moment of my life, was my first impulse to reach out to the very people who had spent 32 years making me feel invisible? It wasn't love. It was a conditioning I hadn't realized was there until that second. It was the invisible chain of the survivor. I had spent my entire life auditioning for their affection, believing that if the tragedy was big enough, if the pain was loud enough, they would finally stop the party and look at me. I had been investing in a relationship that was essentially a Ponzi scheme, pouring my emotional capital into a void, hoping for a return that was never coming. But as the dial tone faded, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud break, it was quiet, like a branch giving way under the weight of too much ice. I didn't call back. I didn't send a text explaining the severity of the situation. Instead, I opened my contacts. I scrolled to Mom, Dad, and Alexis. I didn't feel angry. I felt efficient. I pressed block caller on each of them. It was the first administrative task of my new life as a widow. For the next 72 hours, I navigated the bureaucracy of death alone. I selected a casket made of dark oak because Zachary loved the woods. I wrote the obituary. I organized the service at a small chapel near the frozen lake. The temperature on the day of the funeral was 4 degrees below zero. The wind cut through layers of wool, biting at exposed skin. It was perfect. It was honest. They showed up 20 minutes late. I watched from the front pew as the heavy oak doors creaked open. My parents walked in first, brushing snow off their coats with an air of irritation, as if the weather was a personal affront to them. Alexis followed, stumbling slightly in boots that were fashionable but entirely unsuited for the ice. She was checking her reflection in her phone screen before sliding it into her pocket. They didn't look like grieving relatives. They looked like inconvenienced tourists. When they reached the front, my mother opened her arms, her face arranging itself into a mask of performative sympathy. She moved to hug me, to create the tableau of the grieving family for the few onlookers present. I didn't step forward. I didn't step back. I just stood there, rigid as a statue. I looked at her hands, the same hands that had held a cake knife while my husband lay dead, and I felt nothing. Jasmine, she whispered, her voice tight. We tried to call. Your phone must be broken. It's not broken, I said. My voice was calm, devoid of any tremor. Please sit down. The service is starting. I saw the confusion flicker in her eyes, followed quickly by annoyance. She wasn't used to resistance. She was used to me smoothing things over, making excuses for them. But the Jasmine who did that had died in the waiting room with Zachary? I turned my back on them and looked at the casket. I realized then that I wasn't standing next to my family. I was standing next to strangers who just happened to know my name. And for the first time in 32 years, I didn't owe them a thing. The blizzard had finally passed, leaving the city under a pristine, blinding blanket of white. It had been 72 hours since the funeral. 72 hours of silence. I had spent them in a kind of suspended animation, moving through the house like a ghost, touching Zachary's books, his coffee mug, the unfinished architectural drawings on his desk. The silence wasn't lonely. It was protective. It was the only thing keeping the grief manageable. Then, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a tentative ring. It was 3 sharp, confident presses. I looked out the window. My father's Lexus was idling in the driveway, exhaust puffing into the cold air. My mother was already on the porch, adjusting her scarf. They were here. The blockade had been breached. I opened the door. I didn't invite them in, but they stepped past me anyway, bringing a gust of freezing air and the smell of expensive perfume into the hallway. Jasmine, my father said, nodding gravely, as he stamped snow off his boots. It's freezing out there. Roads are a nightmare. We wanted to give you space, my mother added, unwinding her scarf. She glanced around the living room, her eyes darting to the mantel where Zachary's urn sat. She didn't look at it. She looked past it. But we were worried. You haven't answered a single text. I've been busy, I said. Grieving? Of course, my father said, waving a hand dismissively. He walked into the living room and sat on the sofa, Zachary's spot. He didn't ask where Sophia was. He didn't ask how I was sleeping. He clasped his hands together, leaning forward with the air of a man getting down to business. Look, Jasmine, we know this is a difficult time, he began, his voice dropping into a register I recognized. It was his serious negotiation voice. But tragedy also brings administrative realities. We need to be practical. I stood by the fireplace, crossing my arms. Practical about what? Your future, my mother chimed in, sitting beside him. And ours. We're family, after all. We need to make sure everyone is secure. Secure? Zachary was a planner, my father said. We know he carried a significant life insurance policy. 1.2 million, correct? The number hung in the air, precise and cold. I hadn't told them that number. How do you know that? I asked. People talk, Jasmine. Alexis mentioned it, my mother said quickly. The point is, that's a lot of money for a young widow to manage alone. And considering everything we've done for you over the years? Done for me? The support, my father said, his tone hardening slightly. When you were starting out, the advice, the networking, we invested a lot in you, Jasmine. In your education, your upbringing. We've always been your safety net. I stared at them. My safety net. The people who had missed my college graduation because they were in Cabo. The people who had let me pay for my own wedding because my father claimed his assets were illiquid at the time. So, I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "You're here for a return on investment?" "Don't be crass," my mother snapped. "We're saying it's only fair. Reimbursement. For the years we supported you when Zachary was getting established. We're all grieving, Jasmine, but bills don't stop for grief." They looked at me expectantly, 2 well-dressed vultures perched on my dead husband's furniture. They didn't see a widow. They saw a bank vault that had finally cracked open. "Get out," I whispered. "Jasmine, be reasonable." "Get out," I shouted, the sound startling even me. "Get out of my house!" My father stood up, his face flushing red. "You are making a mistake. You think you can handle this alone? You need us." "I needed you 3 days ago!" I yelled. "I needed you at the hospital! Now? Now I don't need anything from you except your absence." I opened the front door and stood there, shaking, until they walked out. As my father passed me, he paused. He didn't look ashamed. He looked calculating. "Check your privilege, Jasmine," he muttered. "You're sitting on a fortune while your family suffers. Zachary would be ashamed of you." He slammed the door as he left. I locked it. I leaned my forehead against the cold wood and breathed. They were desperate. I could smell it on them like the perfume. People like my parents didn't beg unless they were drowning. And if they were drowning, they would try to pull me under with them. I needed to know why. My father's final words echoed in the hallway long after he'd left. While your family suffers. It was a strange choice of words. Suffer? They lived in a sprawling colonial in Edina. They drove luxury cars. They threw $30,000 parties for Alexis. Where was the suffering? Unless the suffering wasn't emotional. Unless it was financial. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, my hands still trembling slightly. I needed to think. I needed to understand the enemy I was dealing with. My parents had always been obsessed with appearances. The right clothes, the right clubs, the right zip code. It was a religion to them. But religions require tithes, and lately, their spending had seemed manic, even for them. Alexis's gala, the new Lexus, the constant vacations. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a notification from a family sharing app we'd set up years ago for emergencies, mostly just tracking each other's locations. I hadn't looked at it in months, but as I glanced at the screen, a shared calendar alert popped up. It was synced from my mother's phone. Urgent call deadline 4 p.m. I stared at it. A margin call. That meant they were trading on borrowed money, and the market had moved against them. It meant the broker was demanding cash immediately to cover the losses, or they would liquidate everything. It clicked. The desperation, the reimbursement, the anger. They weren't just greedy, they were insolvent. They were living inside a golden shell, hollowed out by debt and delusion. They had assets, the house, the cars, the jewelry, but no liquidity. They were cash poor and drowning, maintaining a lifestyle they couldn't afford to keep up appearances for people they didn't even like. And now, the bill had come due. I realized then that Zachary's death wasn't a tragedy to them, it was a liquidity event. I was their bailout. A cold fury settled in my chest, replacing the grief for a moment. They were willing to guilt-trip a widow, to exploit their own daughter's tragedy, just to save their country club membership. They weren't parents. They were parasites in designer clothing. I thought about the demand, $600,000, half the policy. It wasn't a random number. It was likely exactly what they needed to clear the immediate debts and keep the charade going for another year. If I gave it to them, they wouldn't use it to retire. They would use it to buy more time, more status, more lies. And when it ran out, they would be back. I wasn't just fighting for my money. I was fighting to keep my daughter from being sucked into their black hole. I picked up my phone. I didn't call them. I called the one person who might know exactly how deep the rot went. Mr. Henderson, I said when Zachary's accountant answered. This is Jasmine. I need to see the files. All of them. Specifically, anything related to my parents. There was a long pause on the other end. Jasmine, he said, his voice grave. I've been waiting for you to call. You need to come to the office. There's a box Zachary left for you. Mr. Henderson's office smelled of old paper and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of my parents' home. He was a small man, precise and nervous, the kind of accountant who viewed numbers as moral absolutes. When I arrived, he didn't offer condolences. He simply pointed to a heavy, black file box sitting on his desk. He brought this in 6 months ago, Mr. Henderson said, adjusting his glasses. He said, if anything happened, you were the only one who should open it. I ran my hand over the lid. There was a label maker strip on the top. Do not open unless necessary. What is it? I asked. Forensic accounting, he replied. Zachary was meticulous. I opened the box. Inside, there were no love letters, no sentimental keepsakes. It was filled with bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and emails printed on crisp white paper. I pulled out the top folder. It was labeled The Bailout. I started reading. The dates went back 5 years. The amounts were staggering. October 2019. $15,000 emergency roof repair verified. False money used for cruise. March 2020, $22,000. Business loan company never registered. July 2021, $40,000. Alexis rehab. Alexis was in Ibiza. Page after page. My husband, the man my parents called cheap and unambitious, had been quietly funding their lives for half a decade. He hadn't just helped them, he had been their lifeline. Every time they mocked his thriftiness, every time they rolled their eyes at his sensible car, he was secretly writing checks to keep the lights on in their mansion. I felt a wave of nausea. He had protected me from this. He had absorbed their financial toxicity so I could keep loving them. He knew if I saw the truth, it would break me, so he carried the burden alone. But then I found the ledger at the bottom. It was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Zachary's neat block letters. It was a summary of a transaction dated 3 years ago. Subject, the second mortgage. Amount, $210,000. Status, purchased. I looked up at Mr. Henderson. He paid off their mortgage? Not exactly, the accountant said, a grim look on his face. He didn't pay it off, Jasmine. He bought the note from the bank when they were about to foreclose. He owns the debt. My breath hitched. He owns their house? Technically, his estate does, which means you do. I stared at the document. My parents didn't own their home. They were tenants in a property owned by the man they had despised, and they had the audacity to come to me demanding an inheritance? There's one more thing, Mr. Henderson said, sliding a final document across the desk. The contract. It was a legal agreement signed by my father. His signature was shaky, humiliated. I, Robert, acknowledge this debt and agree that in exchange for Zachary's silence regarding our insolvency, I will never again ask for financial assistance from him or his family. They had signed away their right to ask. They had sworn silence in exchange for salvation. And the moment he died, they broke that promise to rob his widow. I wasn't sad anymore. I was armed. I sat in the quiet of my husband's study, surrounded by the physical proof of his love and their betrayal. The ledger lay open before me, a map of their financial ruin drawn in Zachary's careful hand. But it was the contract that held my attention. The ink was 3 years old, yet the desperation in my father's signature felt fresh. He had signed it to save himself, trading his pride for a roof over his head. And then he had come to my home, sat on my sofa, and demanded $600,000. It wasn't just greed. It was a breach of contract. It was fraud. They were trying to extract money from an estate they were already indebted to. They weren't just bad parents, they were criminals attempting to rob their own granddaughter's future. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Henderson. Is this legally binding? 100%. He confirmed. Zachary had it notarized. He was very specific, Jasmine. He told me, if they ever come for her, give her the ammunition. Ammunition. That's what this was. They thought I was defenseless. A grieving widow they could bully into submission. They didn't know I was holding the deed to their lives. I spent the next hour making copies. One set for me, one set for the lawyer I would inevitably need, and one set for the envelope. I didn't call them. I didn't warn them. I let the silence stretch. I knew they would come back. Desperation has a way of making people bold, and the margin call deadline had likely passed. They were probably scrambling, selling jewelry, taking out payday loans, anything to buy a few more days, but the clock was ticking louder for them than it was for me. I looked at the ledger one last time. The second mortgage purchased. My parents had always acted like they owned the world. They strutted through life with an arrogance that made me feel small, but they owned nothing. Not their house, not their cars, not even their own secrets. Zachary owned it all, and now, so did I. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but the fear was gone. They couldn't hurt me anymore. They couldn't shame me, because I knew the truth. They weren't powerful. They were tenants, and their lease was up. They returned exactly 1 week later. This time, they didn't knock. They pounded. I watched them from the kitchen window. My father was pacing the porch like a caged animal. My mother was standing behind him, arms crossed, looking ready for war. And they had brought reinforcements. Alexis. She was leaning against the railing, holding her phone up, likely recording the injustice for her followers. I wasn't afraid. Fear comes from uncertainty, and I knew exactly how this was going to end. I unlocked the door and opened it. The noise hit me instantly. "You can't keep us out!" my father shouted, pushing past me into the foyer without an invitation. "We spoke to a lawyer. Grandparents' rights are a real thing, Jasmine. You are alienating us from Sophia, and we will drag you to court if we have to. We just want what's best for her," my mother added, her voice shrill. "You're unstable. You're grieving and making irrational decisions. We are her family." Alexis lowered her phone, sneering, "Seriously, Jasmine, Stop being such a drama queen. Just cut the check so we can all go back to normal. They filled the hallway with their noise, their entitlement, their chaotic, desperate energy. They were trying to suffocate me with it. But the house felt different now. It wasn't just a home, it was a courtroom, and the verdict had already been written. Are you done? I asked. My voice was low, level. We are not leaving until we get an agreement, my father spat. 600,000 and visitation. Or we sue the estate. Okay, I said. They blinked, surprised by the sudden capitulation. Sophia? I called out, not looking away from them. From the top of the stairs, small footsteps echoed. Sophia walked down slowly. She was wearing her favorite blue dress. The one Zachary had bought her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't hiding. She held a thick, sealed manila envelope in both hands like a shield. My mother's face softened into a fake smile. Sophia! Honey? Sophia walked right past her. She stopped in front of my father. She looked him in the eye, her expression possessing a gravity far beyond her 9 years. Daddy said to give you this if you came back, she said. She held out the envelope. My father took it, frowning. What is this? Read it, I said. He tore open the seal. He pulled out the stack of papers. The first thing he saw was the deed, then the assignment of mortgage, then the ledger, and finally, the contract with his own shaky signature at the bottom. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. I watched the color drain from his face. It started at his jaw and vanished downward until he looked like gray ash. His hands started to shake. The papers rattled a dry, dead sound. He choked out. You knew? I know everything I said. I know about the bailout. I know about the second mortgage. I know about the contract you signed promising to leave us alone. My mother grabbed the papers from him, scanning them frantically. When she realized what they were, she gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Alexis looked between them, confused, her phone recording a disaster she didn't understand yet. You don't own your house, I said, my voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. The estate does, which means I do. I took a step forward. For the first time in my life, I was the tallest person in the room. You came here demanding 50% of Zachary's money. You actually owe the estate $210,000, plus interest. My father looked at me, his eyes wide with terror. The arrogance was gone. The bluster was gone. He was just an insolvent tenant facing his landlord. But, he stammered, we're family. No, I said. We're a transaction. And I'm closing the account. I pointed to the door. Leave now. Never contact me or Sophia again. Do that, and I forgive the debt. I burn the contract. You keep the house. I paused, letting the alternative hang in the air. Stay one more minute, and I foreclose tomorrow. They left without another word. My father stumbled as he went down the porch steps, clutching the envelope like it was a physical wound. My mother was sobbing quietly, a sound that might have broken my heart a decade ago, but now just sounded like the inevitable result of a lifetime of bad choices. Alexis followed them, her phone finally lowered, her face pale. I stood in the doorway and watched until their taillights disappeared into the white haze of the street. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of grief. It was the clean, expansive silence of a fresh start. I went back inside. Sophia was sitting on the rug in front of the fireplace, petting our cat. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and knowing. Are they gone forever? She asked. I sat down next to her and pulled her into my lap. Yes, baby, they're gone. Good, she whispered. They were loud. I laughed, a sound that surprised me. It was jagged and raw, but it was real. That night, I sat by the fire with a glass of wine and the rest of Zachary's files. I found one last document I hadn't looked at closely before. It was a draft for a trust fund he had started planning but never finished. He had wanted to create something to help families in crisis. I picked up a pen. I had $600,000 remaining from the policy money my parents had tried to steal, money they had desperately needed to maintain their illusion. I wasn't going to spend it on luxury. I wasn't going to hoard it. I was going to use it to make sure no one else ever felt as trapped as I had. I established the Zachary Shield Fund. It wasn't just a charity, it was a resource. It provided legal aid and financial counseling for families dealing with financial abuse. It helped survivors of toxic enmeshment disentangle their assets and protect their futures. Every time we helped a family save their home from a predatory relative, every time we helped a widow lock down her estate against greedy in-laws, I felt like I was planting a seed in the scorched earth my parents had left behind. True revenge isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. They do a fine job of destroying themselves. True revenge is taking the resources they tried to steal and using them to build something they can never touch. It's building a legacy of protection where there used to be vulnerability. As I watched the fire burn down to embers, I looked at the photo of Zachary on the mantle. He wasn't just my husband. He was the architect of my freedom. And now, I was the builder of his legacy. If you've ever had to build a wall to protect your peace, share this story. You are not alone.